My secret son became my billionaire CEO ex-husband's intern, and they worked side by side for 3 months without knowing each other. Some moments don't arrive loudly. They don't announce themselves with raised voices or dramatic movement. They arrive quietly and change everything. Daniel Wright had reviewed thousands of files in his lifetime. Resumes, contracts, acquisitions, documents that decided the future of companies and the direction of industries. Numbers never rattled him. Decisions never slowed his hand. But this file did. The office was silent except for the distant hum of the building settling into its evening rhythm. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched endlessly below him, alive and unaware. Inside, Daniel stood still, one hand resting on the desk, the other gripping a thin folder that suddenly felt heavier than anything he had ever held. He read the name again. Jason Wuckert. He didn't know why his breath caught. He didn't know why his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with stress or exhaustion. He only knew that something deep inside him was shifting, aligning, connecting dots that had never existed before this moment. A date stared back at him. 19 years ago. The room seemed smaller now, not because the walls moved, but because the truth had. Daniel lowered himself into the chair behind his desk, slower than usual, as if moving too quickly might make what he was realizing disappear. His eyes drifted toward the window, but he wasn't seeing the city anymore. He was seeing a young man standing confidently across from him just weeks earlier. Respectful, focused, familiar in ways Daniel had never questioned. The intern, the one who listened more than he spoke, the one who carried himself with quiet certainty. The one who reminded Daniel of himself, though he had never understood why. His fingers trembled as the realization finally settled, complete and undeniable. How do you work beside your own son and never know? That question lingered in the air, unanswered, heavy, refusing to move on. Before this moment, Daniel had believed he understood regret. He had believed he knew what absence felt like. But this was different. This was not about something lost. This was about something lived right in front of him, every day, without recognition. And somewhere else in the city, a woman had known this truth all along. Have you ever loved someone and walked away without explaining why? Not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much to risk breaking what little peace remained? Have you ever protected a secret for so long that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a responsibility? And what would you do if the past you carefully folded away for years suddenly stood in front of you, confident, capable, and carrying a future that was shaped by you? Without your knowledge, this is not a story that begins with betrayal or cruelty. It begins with silence. For 19 years, Chanel Wuckert lived with a truth that never left her side. It followed her through quiet mornings and long evenings. It sat beside her during small celebrations and private worries. It never demanded attention, but it never loosened its grip either. Chanel did not see herself as strong. She saw herself as careful with words, careful with memories, careful with the story she never told. From the outside, her life appeared steady, predictable, safe. She lived in a modest apartment that held more warmth than space. She worked consistently, paid her bills on time, and raised her son with an attention that came from knowing how easily life could shift if you weren't paying attention. Jason was her pride, not because of awards or recognition, but because of who he was when no one was watching. He listened, he worked hard, he treated people with respect, and every time she looked at him, she saw pieces of a man she once loved, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that reminded her how deeply choices echo forward. Daniel Wright, on the other hand, lived surrounded by people, and yet remained alone in ways he never discussed. He had achieved everything he once dreamed of. Influence, security, a name that carried weight in rooms where decisions mattered. His companies shaped careers, his signature opened doors, his presence commanded attention. Still, there was an absence he could never name. He felt it late at night when the office emptied and the world quieted. He felt it during milestones that should have felt complete. He felt it when success arrived and brought no sense of arrival with it. He told himself this was the cost of ambition. He told himself everyone sacrificed something. He never asked what he might have lost before he even realized it was missing. And then Jason walked into his office. Jason didn't know he was stepping into a legacy tied to his blood. He only knew he had earned a chance, a competitive internship at one of the most powerful companies in the city. He knew he wanted to prove himself. He knew he didn't want special treatment. And he knew he wanted to learn from the man whose name was etched into the skyline. Jason saw Daniel Wright as a mentor before he ever saw him as a man. He listened closely in meetings. He asked thoughtful questions. He stayed late without complaint, not because he was trying to impress, but because something about the work mattered to him. Something about the challenge felt right. Daniel noticed, not immediately, but enough to pause. There was something familiar in the way Jason processed information, in the way he waited before responding, in the way he stood when addressed. Daniel felt a sense of pride he hadn't earned, and that should have unsettled him more than it did. Instead, it felt natural. At home, Chanel listened as Jason talked about his days, about the pressure, about the expectations, about Daniel. "He's demanding," Jason said once, smiling as he loosened his tie. "But he actually listens. He pushes you, not because he wants control, but because he wants you to be better." Chanel kept her expression steady, her voice calm. "Yes," she replied softly. "He always did." She never asked questions she didn't want answered. She never corrected Jason when admiration colored his voice. She never told him that the man shaping his future had unknowingly shaped his existence, because silence had become her language. And silence, when held long enough, becomes heavy. This story is about three people standing close to one another without seeing the full picture. A woman who believed protection sometimes meant withholding truth. A man who believed success would eventually fill every empty space. And a son who unknowingly bridged two lives that never truly stopped reaching for one another. Nothing here happens by chance. Nothing here is rushed. Every moment is earned. As you listen, you'll be asked to sit with questions that don't have easy answers. You'll be invited into choices that feel right and wrong at the same time, and you'll witness how love doesn't disappear when it's left unattended. It waits. Before we continue, I want to welcome everyone joining us for the first time and those returning to spend another moment here. This space is built for stories that move slowly, breathe deeply, and leave room for reflection. If that's the kind of storytelling you value, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And as you listen, I invite you to think about this. Does silence protect the people we love, or does it only delay the moment they deserve the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters here. Because this story is not about guilt. It's not about blame. It's about timing, choice, and the quiet ways love insists on finding its way back. And by the end, you'll understand how 3 months of working side by side changed lives that had been connected for nearly 2 decades, without a single word of truth spoken. Let's begin at the only place this story could truly start, with the silence that grew, and the truth that waited patiently inside it. Silence did not enter Chanel Walkert's life suddenly. It arrived gradually, the way habits do. Unnoticed at first, then indispensable. It settled into her routines, her pauses, her choices. It followed her into rooms and sat beside her during long nights when sleep refused to come easily. Over time, it stopped feeling like something she carried and began to feel like something that carried her. Chanel never thought of herself as extraordinary. She didn't believe her life held the kind of drama that demanded attention. If asked, she would have described herself as practical, measured, someone who made decisions carefully and lived with them fully. Her apartment reflected that mindset, clean but not perfect, comfortable rather than impressive. The walls held framed photographs instead of artwork, moments frozen in time rather than things meant to impress. A young boy on a swing, laughing so hard his feet barely touched the ground. A high school graduation smile, proud but restrained. A mother and son standing close, always just close enough. Jason, every corner of Chanel's life was shaped around him, morning routines adjusted to his schedule, evenings shaped by his needs. Her choices filtered through a single constant question: will this protect him? For 19 years, the answer had always been the same: yes. Jason grew up knowing consistency. He knew what it meant to be supported, even when money was tight or days were long. He knew his mother worked hard, not just at her job, but at being present. She attended school events, listened when he talked, and noticed things other parents might miss. She noticed when his curiosity deepened. She noticed when his confidence grew quieter, steadier. She noticed when he began to carry himself with a seriousness that felt inherited rather than learned. What she never told him was why. Some truths feel too large to speak aloud, others feel too fragile, and some feel like they belong to more than one life, making it impossible to place them without disrupting everything they touch. Chanel learned early that silence could be a form of control, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that steadies. Silence allowed her to move forward without reopening wounds she had already survived. It gave her space to rebuild without constantly looking back. And yet, the past never truly left. Daniel Wright lived there, not in memory alone, but in subtle echoes. In the way Jason focused when something mattered. In the way he listened more than he spoke. In the way he absorbed pressure without complaining. Chanel saw it and said nothing. There were nights when she sat at the small kitchen table long after Jason had gone to bed, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her thoughts drifting toward a version of herself that no longer existed. A younger woman who believed love would be enough to carry two people through anything. She remembered how simple things once felt, conversations that stretched late into the night, dreams spoken aloud without fear of outgrowing them. The comfort of believing the future was shared. Daniel had been thoughtful then. Not grand or dramatic, but present. He listened when she spoke. He remembered small details others overlooked. He believed in possibility without demanding certainty. When his ambition began to take shape, she admired it. She never saw it as a threat. She saw it as movement, forward, upward, purposeful. What she hadn't anticipated was how quietly distance could grow. Silence returned then too. Not the kind she would later choose, but the kind that creeps in when conversations become shorter and time becomes scarce. Plans postponed. Promises assumed rather than renewed. When Chanel discovered she was pregnant, silence changed shape. At first, it was protective. She wanted the moment to be right. She wanted Daniel to be ready. She wanted certainty before speaking words that would alter both their lives forever. She told herself she would wait until the pressure eased. Until his schedule slowed, until the future felt stable enough to hold something so permanent. But time did not wait with her. Days passed. Weeks followed. Conversations became fewer, and what began as patience turned into hesitation. Hesitation turned into fear. Fear turned into distance. By the time Chanel realized how far apart they had drifted, silence had already taken root. Leaving was not an act of anger. It was an act of self-preservation wrapped in uncertainty. She told herself space would clarify things. That distance might restore what closeness had strained. She never imagined that space would become permanent. Daniel watched her walk away without knowing what she carried with her. He never heard the words that might have changed everything. And Chanel never spoke them, not because she didn't believe he deserved to know, but because she believed timing mattered more than intention. When Jason was born, her world narrowed beautifully. Pain and fear gave way to purpose. Every breath she took after that was shaped by a new responsibility. She named him Wuckert, her name, not out of resentment, but out of resolve. She would be enough. She would give him stability, love, and guidance. She would build a life that didn't rely on explanations she wasn't ready to give. And she did. Jason never felt abandoned. He never felt incomplete. He felt supported, encouraged, seen. And as he grew older, Chanel watched him step into his own potential with a quiet confidence that both filled her with pride and stirred something uneasy beneath it, because the truth remained. As Jason approached adulthood, silence became heavier, not unbearable, but present. It followed Chanel into moments she could no longer ignore. College applications, career conversations, questions about the future. She told herself she would speak when it became necessary. She told herself she would know when the time was right. Then Jason received the email, an internship, competitive, prestigious, earned, right enterprises. The name hit her like a memory she hadn't prepared for. It carried weight, history, consequences she had carefully kept at a distance. Jason's excitement was genuine, his pride well-earned. He saw opportunity where she saw convergence. That night, after Jason went to bed, Chanel stood alone by the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Lights flickered in buildings she had never entered. Lives unfolded in directions she could not control. For the first time in years, silence felt less like protection and more like anticipation. Somewhere else, Daniel Wright sat in an office that bore his name. He reviewed documents that shaped futures, unaware that one future had already found its way to him. He felt the familiar absence and dismissed it, as he always did. None of them knew yet how close they were to answers they hadn't asked. Silence had done its work. It had grown patiently, carefully, and now it was ready to speak. Morning arrived without ceremony. Soft light filtered through the narrow kitchen window, touching the edges of the counter and catching on the steam rising from a forgotten cup of coffee. The city outside was already awake, traffic moving with purpose, voices drifting upward from the street. But inside the apartment, time moved differently. Chanel stood at the counter, one hand resting on the cool surface, the other loosely holding a spoon she hadn't used in minutes. The coffee sat untouched beside her. She hadn't noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Behind her, a door opened quietly. "Mom?" She turned at the sound of Jason's voice, her expression settling into a smile that came as naturally as breathing. He stood near the hallway mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie with careful precision. His posture was straight, his movements controlled, but the energy beneath it all was unmistakable. Excitement, nervousness, hope. At 19, Jason carried himself with a confidence that didn't demand attention. It was the kind that came from preparation rather than assumption. He had always been like that, thoughtful, steady, determined. "Do I look professional enough?" he asked, a hint of laughter in his voice as he tugged lightly at his collar. Chanel stepped toward him without hesitation. She reached up, straightening the tie where his fingers had tightened it too much. Her touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary, grounding herself in the familiarity of him. "You look exactly where you belong," she said. Jason's smile widened, relief softening his features. He exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. "I still can't believe they picked me," he said. "Out of everyone?" Chanel met his eyes in the mirror. She saw her son, and she saw echoes of someone else too. "They didn't just pick you," she replied gently. "You earned it." Jason nodded, absorbing the words as he always did. Praise from her was never exaggerated. When she said something mattered, it did. He glanced at his watch, then back at her. "First day at Wright Enterprises," he said, shaking his head slightly. "It doesn't feel real yet." The name landed between them, unspoken weight pressing into the quiet. Chanel kept her expression calm. Years of composure held firm, even as something tightened in her chest. "It will," she said. "Once you're there." Jason grabbed his bag from the chair and slung it over his shoulder. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. "I'll call you after work," he said. She nodded. "I'll be right here." He hugged her, quick but warm, familiar in the way only years of shared life can make something feel. When he pulled away, she caught a glimpse of the boy he once was, layered beneath the man he was becoming. Then the door closed behind him. The apartment fell quiet. Chanel stood still, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade down the hall, then the distant echo of the building door opening and closing. Only when she was certain he was gone did she allow herself to breathe fully. She reached for the coffee and took a sip. It was cold. Setting the mug down, she moved slowly to the window and looked out over the street below. People passed with purpose, unaware that something monumental had just stepped into motion. Jason walked with confidence toward a future he believed was his alone, and she knew better. The man whose name crowned half the skyline, the one whose influence shaped industries and opened doors, was not just Jason's employer. He was Jason's father, and neither of them knew it. At Wright Enterprises, the building stood tall and unyielding, its glass exterior reflecting ambition back at anyone who looked too closely. Inside, the atmosphere carried expectation, the quiet understanding that excellence was not optional. Daniel Wright arrived early, as he often did. His schedule was already full before most of the city had settled into its morning rhythm. Meetings lined his calendar. Decisions waited for his attention. He moved through the lobby with ease, nodding to familiar faces, acknowledging greetings with brief but genuine recognition. Power had never been something he wielded loudly. It followed him naturally, shaped by years of consistency and results. In his office, he reviewed reports with practiced efficiency, numbers, projections, strategies, all familiar territory. Yet even as he worked, that same absence hovered at the edge of his awareness, a sense that something remained unresolved. He dismissed it, as he always did. A knock sounded at the door. "Your interns are here," his assistant said. "Ready for introductions?" "Send them in," Daniel replied. Moments later, a small group entered the room. Young, eager, composed. Daniel scanned them quickly, assessing posture, expression, presence. Then Jason stepped forward. "Good morning, sir," he said. "I'm Jason Wuckert." Daniel looked up and paused. It was brief, barely noticeable, but something in the young man's presence caught his attention in a way he couldn't explain. Not the words, not the confidence, the familiarity. "Welcome," Daniel said after a moment. "We expect honesty and commitment here." "You'll have both," Jason replied without hesitation. Daniel nodded, studying him just a fraction longer than the others before moving on. He told himself it was nothing, just another intern, another name, yet the feeling lingered. As the day unfolded, Jason absorbed everything, the pace, the expectations, the unspoken standards that governed the room. He took notes, asked thoughtful questions when appropriate, and listened closely when others spoke. Daniel noticed. He didn't comment on it. He simply adjusted his expectations. By late afternoon, Jason was already contributing, quietly, effectively. He didn't seek attention. He didn't shy away from responsibility. He approached challenges with focus rather than fear. At home that evening, Chanel waited. Jason arrived just after sunset, his energy still buzzing despite the long day. He set his bag down and leaned against the counter, loosening his tie with a satisfied breath. "So," Chanel asked, handing him a glass of water. He took it, smiling. "It was intense," he said, "but good, really good." She watched him closely, noting the way his eyes lit up when he spoke. "And Daniel right?" she asked carefully. Jason laughed softly. "He's demanding," he said, "but fair. He pushes you to think, not just follow instructions. He actually cares if you understand why something matters." Chanel nodded, her expression steady. "Yes," she said quietly. "He always did." Jason didn't notice the weight behind the words. He continued talking, describing the office, the expectations, the atmosphere. Chanel listened, absorbing every detail, each one reinforcing the reality she had been avoiding. This wasn't just a job. This was convergence. That night, long after Jason had gone to bed, Chanel sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was still. The city outside hummed faintly, distant and indifferent. For years, silence had been her shield. It had allowed her to build a life rooted in care and intention. It had kept the past from intruding on the present. But now, silence felt different. It felt like a threshold. 3 lives had begun moving closer, pulled together by choices made long ago. None of them had spoken the truth yet, but the space between them was shrinking, and for the first time Chanel wondered not if the silence would break, but when. Before success reshaped Daniel Wright into a name people recognized, he was simply a man with ideas and time enough to listen. Chanel met him during a season of life that felt unhurried. They were younger then, still learning how much patience mattered and how easily it could be taken for granted. Their paths crossed through shared routines rather than dramatic coincidence, the kind of meeting that feels ordinary at first and only reveals its importance much later. Their first real conversation happened in a small cafe tucked between offices and apartments, a place people passed through more often than they stayed. Chanel remembered noticing how Daniel paid attention when she spoke, not in the exaggerated way people sometimes perform interest, but with a quiet focus that made her words feel valued. "This coffee is terrible," she said after a tentative sip, grimacing slightly. Daniel smiled, glancing at his own cup. "Then we've made a mutual mistake." She laughed, surprised by how easy it felt. They talked longer than either planned, about work, about books, about the strange comfort of sitting with someone who didn't rush to fill every pause. When they finally stood to leave, it felt less like an ending and more like an agreement, unspoken but understood. They didn't rush into anything after that. Their connection unfolded gradually, shaped by consistency rather than intensity. Late conversations became routine. Walks replaced plans. Silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Daniel wasn't wealthy then. He didn't speak in grand visions or promises. He talked about ideas he was still shaping, goals he hadn't fully defined yet. Chanel admired that he didn't pretend certainty where there wasn't any. He worked hard. He paid attention. He believed effort mattered. What drew her most was how present he was. When she spoke, he listened. When she worried, he didn't dismiss it. He treated her dreams with the same seriousness he treated his own. Chanel found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She spoke about her fears, her hopes, the future she imagined but hadn't planned yet. Daniel never rushed her. He never tried to solve things that didn't need fixing. They learned each other slowly. He learned how she took her tea, how she liked quiet mornings, how she processed decisions internally before ever speaking them aloud. She learned how he focused when something mattered, how his mind worked through problems methodically, how deeply he valued integrity, even when it made things harder. Love didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in quietly. By the time Chanel realized how much she cared, it already felt stable, safe, shared. Daniel's ambition grew during that time, not explosively, but steadily. Opportunities began to appear. Responsibilities expanded. Conversations shifted from ideas to execution. Chanel encouraged him. She believed in him without reservation. When doubts crept in, she reminded him of his capacity. When setbacks appeared, she stayed steady. One evening, as they sat together after a long day, Chanel rested her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Promise me something," she said softly. Daniel tilted his head slightly, curious. "What?" "Promise you'll stay kind," she said, "no matter how far you go." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand gently against her back, considering the weight of the request. "I promise," he said finally. "That won't change." She believed him. For a long time, it didn't. As Daniel's career advanced, his time became less flexible. Meetings extended into evenings. Travel became more frequent. The rhythm they had built began to shift. At first, it was manageable. They adjusted. They communicated. But slowly, moments grew shorter. Conversations became more functional. Plans were postponed with the assumption they could be revisited later. Chanel noticed before Daniel did. She noticed when he arrived home distracted, when his mind lingered elsewhere during conversations, when exhaustion replaced curiosity. She understood pressure. She respected commitment. She didn't demand attention he couldn't give. Still, something felt different. When Chanel discovered she was pregnant, the knowledge landed gently and heavily all at once. It wasn't fear that filled her. It was awareness that this truth would reshape everything. She wanted to tell Daniel immediately. The words formed easily in her mind, but timing mattered. His schedule was relentless, his stress visible. She told herself she would wait for the right moment. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel's focus remained fixed outward, toward goals he believed required full attention. Chanel watched and waited, uncertain how to introduce something that demanded just as much. As silence grew, doubt followed. What if the moment was never right? What if telling him now meant adding pressure he couldn't carry? What if love, stretched too thin, broke under the weight? Chanel carried those questions quietly. One evening, after another conversation cut short by an urgent call, she sat alone and realized how much she was holding by herself. The truth had become heavier than she expected. Leaving wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was shaped by uncertainty and the belief that distance might bring clarity. She told herself space would help him refocus. That time apart might restore what proximity had strained. She never imagined it would become permanent. The goodbye was understated. No raised voices, no accusations, just a quiet separation marked by things left unsaid. Daniel watched her go without understanding why. He assumed time would correct what distance had caused. He believed there would be another conversation. There wasn't. When Jason was born, Chanel felt both joy and resolve. She would build something steady. She would provide consistency. She would be enough. And she was. Years passed. Jason grew into himself under her careful guidance. She taught him the value of effort, honesty, and accountability. The same values she once admired in Daniel. She never spoke his name. Daniel, meanwhile, built the life he had envisioned. Success arrived gradually, then fully. His name gained recognition. His influence expanded. Yet something remained absent. He didn't know what it was. He assumed it was the cost of focus, the result of prioritizing growth. He never connected it to the woman who had left quietly, carrying a future he never knew existed. Now, decades later, that future walked into his office each morning. Jason embodied the qualities Daniel valued most, not because they were taught intentionally, but because they were inherited in ways neither of them recognized. Daniel felt drawn to him without explanation. He pushed him harder than the others, expected more, offered guidance he rarely gave. Jason rose to every expectation. At home, Chanel listened as Jason spoke about his mentor, careful never to reveal too much of her reaction. "He challenges me," Jason said one night. "He doesn't let me settle." Chanel smiled softly. "That's good." She didn't tell him how familiar that sounded. As the past quietly aligned with the present, love returned to the edges of their lives, not as a demand but as a reminder. What Chanel and Daniel once shared hadn't vanished. It had waited, and now, with time closing the distance between what was and what could be, the ease they once knew stood ready to be tested again. Not by ambition, but by truth. Pressure doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It accumulates quietly, layering responsibility over intention, until even the strongest bonds begin to strain under the weight. For Daniel Wright, opportunity multiplied quickly. What began as long hours became full calendars. What once felt like momentum turned into obligation. Each success brought new expectations, and each expectation demanded more time than the last. He didn't notice the shift at first. He believed commitment required sacrifice, and sacrifice was temporary. He told himself that once things stabilized, balance would return on its own. Chanel noticed everything. She noticed how often Daniel's attention drifted mid-conversation, how meals were interrupted by calls he felt unable to ignore, how evenings once spent talking were now spent waiting. She didn't confront him, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood pressure. She believed love meant patience. Still, the space between them grew. When Chanel realized she was pregnant, the truth changed shape inside her. It wasn't fear that held her back from speaking, it was timing. Daniel was carrying more than he ever had before. His exhaustion was visible, his focus divided. She told herself she would wait until things slowed. She wanted the moment to be calm, thoughtful, shared, but time moved faster than she expected. Each day that passed without the right moment made the next harder. The words remained ready, but doubt crept in alongside them. Would this news be received with joy or worry? Would it feel like partnership or pressure? Chanel carried those questions alone. Daniel sensed something was wrong, but not what it was. He attributed the distance to stress, his own and hers. He believed effort alone could solve it later. Later never arrived. One evening, after another plan was postponed without discussion, Chanel realized how tired she felt. Not physically, but emotionally. She was holding too much by herself. Leaving wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and deliberate. She told herself that space would protect them both. That clarity might come from distance. Daniel watched her go, confused but not alarmed. He assumed separation was temporary. He believed they would talk when things settled. They didn't. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into silence neither of them knew how to break. When Jason was born, Chanel felt a shift that grounded her completely. The uncertainty that had followed her vanished the moment she held him. Purpose replaced doubt. She didn't regret her decision. She committed to it. Raising Jason alone wasn't easy, but it was steady. She built routines. She offered consistency. She became everything he needed her to be, and she never spoke Daniel's name. Years passed. Jason grew. He asked questions like any child did, but never one she couldn't answer truthfully without revealing everything. He accepted her explanations because he trusted her. Daniel, meanwhile, built a life he believed required full devotion. His success expanded. His name gained influence. Yet even as accomplishments stacked higher, a quiet absence followed him. He assumed it was the cost of ambition. He never connected it to the woman who had walked away carrying his future. Now, decades later, that future sat across from him in conference rooms and elevators. Jason mirrored his instincts, his discipline, his way of listening before responding. Daniel felt an unspoken pride he didn't understand. At home, Chanel felt the weight of the past pressing closer. Each story Jason told about his mentor felt like a reminder of what she had chosen not to say. The goodbye she once believed was temporary had lasted far longer than she ever intended, and now, with distance closing and silence thinning, the truth waited patiently, unchanged by time, ready to demand its place. Daniel Wright's mornings followed a rhythm he no longer questioned. He arrived before most of the building came fully alive, his car slipping into the underground garage while the city above still stretched itself awake. The ride up the private elevator was silent, uninterrupted by conversation or announcement. He preferred it that way. Silence, in this space, felt efficient. By the time he reached his floor, his assistant had already arranged the day, meetings spaced with precision, documents queued in order of urgency, calls scheduled down to the minute. Everything had a place. Daniel moved through it all with practiced ease. He read quickly. He listened carefully. He spoke with purpose. Years of decision-making had trained him to separate emotion from outcome, urgency from importance. From the outside, it looked like mastery. Glass walls framed his office, offering a sweeping view of the city. The height alone reminded visitors of his position. Floors below bustled with activity shaped by choices made in rooms like this one. Entire departments shifted direction based on his approval. Yet when the door closed and the room settled, something always lingered. An absence. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't interrupt his work. It existed quietly, present enough to be noticed, distant enough to be ignored. Daniel told himself it was normal. Success demanded focus. Focus required sacrifice. Everyone at this level felt it, even if they didn't speak about it. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuff, and took his seat behind the desk that bore his name. The morning passed in measured segments, a discussion about expansion, a review of performance metrics, a brief exchange with legal about a contract nearing final approval. Daniel remained engaged, precise, unflinching. Still, between moments his mind drifted, not toward regret exactly, toward something unresolved. He dismissed it and moved on. His assistant appeared mid-morning, tablet in hand. "The new interns are ready," she said. "I'll bring them in when you're prepared." Daniel nodded. "Send them in." He leaned back slightly as he waited, gaze moving to the skyline beyond the glass. The city stretched endlessly, a collection of ambitions layered atop one another. He had once believed reaching this height would bring a sense of completion. It hadn't. The door opened, and a small group entered, each carrying a version of the same thing, anticipation wrapped in restraint. Daniel scanned them briefly, noting posture, eye contact, presence. Most young professionals revealed themselves immediately. Some overcompensated, some withdrew. Some tried too hard to appear confident. One stepped forward without hesitation. "Good morning, sir," the young man said. "Jason Wuckert." Daniel looked up. The moment stretched, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to register. Jason stood straight, hands relaxed at his sides, expression open but focused. There was no nervous energy in his voice, no attempt to impress, just clarity. Daniel felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. "Welcome," he said evenly. "This environment demands honesty, discipline, and commitment." "You'll have all three," Jason replied. Daniel held his gaze for a fraction longer than necessary before moving on. As introductions continued, Daniel found his attention returning to Jason more than once. It wasn't the name, it wasn't the credentials, it was something less tangible, familiarity without memory. The interns were dismissed to orientation, and Daniel returned to his schedule. Yet as the day progressed, his focus slipped in small, unexpected ways. During a meeting, his thoughts returned to the way Jason had spoken. During a call, he replayed the exchange without knowing why. He told himself it was nothing. Over the following days, Jason distinguished himself quickly. He arrived early, stayed late, asked questions that revealed understanding rather than confusion. He absorbed feedback without defensiveness and applied it immediately. Daniel noticed. He assigned Jason tasks he typically reserved for more experienced team members. Not out of favoritism, but out of instinct, Jason met every expectation. During meetings, Daniel began directing questions toward him, not to test, but to involve. Jason responded thoughtfully, never speaking more than necessary. "You think ahead," Daniel observed one afternoon. "I try to," Jason replied. Daniel nodded. "It matters." Their interactions remained professional, measured, and yet something about them felt different. Daniel felt invested in Jason's progress in a way he hadn't with other interns. He found himself offering guidance without realizing he was doing it. "Don't rush the conclusion," he said once. "Let the data speak before you do." Jason nodded. "That's how I was taught." The words lingered. Daniel felt an unexpected swell of pride. It startled him. At home that evening, Daniel poured himself a drink and stood by the window of his high-rise apartment. The city lights stretched endlessly below, distant and detached. He thought about his day, about meetings and decisions, and about a young man whose presence unsettled him for reasons he couldn't define. Jason, meanwhile, returned to his own apartment with a sense of purpose he hadn't expected to feel so soon. He replayed conversations in his head, considering feedback, refining ideas. When he spoke to his mother that night, his tone carried admiration. "He challenges you," Jason said, "but not in a way that feels controlling. He wants you to understand the work, not just do it." Chanel listened carefully, her expression calm. "That's important," she said. "He reminds me of the kind of leader I want to be," Jason added. Chanel nodded, her grip tightening slightly around the mug in her hands. "Yes," she said quietly. "He always valued that." Back at the office, days blended into weeks. Daniel's routine remained intact, yet Jason's presence became part of it. He expected him to be prepared. He expected him to deliver, and Jason did. The familiarity deepened. Daniel caught himself studying Jason when he thought no one was watching, noticing the way he focused, the way he weighed decisions, the way he handled pressure. It felt unsettling. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Daniel found Jason still at his desk, reviewing a report. "You don't have to stay this late," Daniel said. Jason looked up. "I wanted to finish this before tomorrow." Daniel nodded. "Efficiency matters, but so does rest." Jason smiled slightly. "I'll remember that." Daniel walked away, unsettled by how natural the exchange felt. At the top, power offered control, influence, recognition, but it also demanded distance. Daniel had learned that early. Relationships complicated decisions. Attachment introduced risk, and yet, without intending to, he felt himself forming one. Not personal, not inappropriate, but meaningful. The office, once a place of pure function, now carried an undercurrent Daniel couldn't ignore. He didn't know why. He only knew that something unresolved had found its way into his carefully ordered life. And for the first time in years, success felt insufficient, not because he wanted more, but because something essential remained unnamed. The unease followed him home. It followed him into sleep. And it waited. The first month passed quietly. Jason settled into the rhythm of right enterprises faster than most. He learned the pace, the expectations, the unspoken rules that governed decisions long before they were announced. He observed more than he spoke, absorbing how leadership moved through the building without needing to announce itself. Daniel noticed immediately. He didn't say so at first. He simply adjusted. Where he once assigned Jason small tasks, he began involving him in discussions that required judgment. Where he once expected execution, he began asking for perspective. Jason paused, considering carefully. "They don't account for behavior shifts. If we proceed now, we'll gain efficiency, but we may lose trust in the long term." Daniel studied him, then nodded. "Good. That's the question that matters." Jason left the room that day with a sense of quiet validation. Not pride, not yet, but confirmation that he was in the right place. Daniel, meanwhile, felt something unfamiliar. Satisfaction, yes, but also something deeper, a sense of alignment he hadn't experienced in years. By the second month, mentorship formed naturally. Daniel didn't announce it. He didn't schedule formal sessions. He simply began expecting Jason to be there, in meetings, in discussions, in moments where decisions were shaped before they reached final form. Jason rose to the challenge without resistance. He stayed late when needed, asked questions that revealed intention rather than uncertainty, accepted correction without defensiveness. "You don't argue when I challenge you," Daniel noted one evening. Jason shrugged slightly. "If I'm wrong, I want to know before it matters." Daniel smiled faintly. "That will take you far." They began sharing brief moments outside structured work, elevator rides after long meetings, late evenings when the floor emptied and the building settled into stillness. In those moments, conversation shifted. "You remind me of myself," Daniel said once, staring ahead as the elevator descended. Jason glanced at him. "Is that a warning or encouragement?" Daniel exhaled softly. "A reminder. To be careful with ambition." Jason nodded. "I've seen what it costs when it's not balanced." Daniel turned toward him, surprised. "Where?" Jason hesitated, then answered honestly. "In people who never slow down long enough to notice what they're missing." The elevator doors opened. Daniel stepped out without responding, but the words followed him. At home, Jason spoke openly about his days, about the pressure, about the responsibility, about Daniel. "He doesn't waste words," Jason said one evening, setting his bag down. "When he speaks, it matters." Chanel listened, careful not to interrupt. "He notices things," Jason continued. "The way people think, the way they hesitate. He pushes you to be better, but not louder." Chanel nodded. "That sounds like him." Jason paused. "You knew leaders like that?" She met his gaze. "I knew one." Jason smiled. "I'm glad I get to learn from him." The third month brought deeper trust. Daniel began delegating decisions, not just tasks. He asked Jason to draft proposals, to challenge assumptions, to anticipate consequences. "You think ahead," Daniel said again one night. "That's rare." Jason smiled slightly. "I was raised to." Daniel felt the words settle somewhere uncomfortably close. They worked late that evening, reviewing projections in a conference room lit softly against the darkened city outside. Most of the building was empty. The quiet allowed space for thought. "You ever think about what you want beyond this?" Daniel asked suddenly. Jason considered. "I want to build something that lasts, something that doesn't just look successful." Daniel nodded. "That distinction matters more than people realize." There were moments, small, fleeting, where truth nearly surfaced. A shared gesture, a mirrored expression, a comment that lingered longer than intended. Once, during a meeting, Daniel caught himself saying, "That's exactly how I would have approached it." Jason looked up, surprised. "Really?" Daniel paused. "Yes." The room went quiet for a beat too long. Neither spoke. At home, Chanel felt the tension growing. Jason's admiration was genuine, his growth visible. She watched him step into confidence, shaped by guidance she recognized all too well. Each story he told tightened something in her chest. "He trusts me," Jason said one night. "He expects me to think like a leader." Chanel smiled, though her voice softened. "He always respected that." Jason frowned slightly. "You say that like you knew him." She took a breath. "I knew someone very much like him." Jason didn't press. He trusted her. Daniel, meanwhile, began feeling unsettled by the depth of his investment. He reviewed his behavior, questioned his motives, searched for professional boundaries. Everything checked out. And yet the feeling remained. One evening, as Jason prepared to leave, Daniel stopped him. "You did well today," he said. "You handled pressure without hesitation." Jason nodded. "Thank you. That means a lot." Daniel hesitated. "I don't say that lightly." The words stayed with Daniel long after Jason left. The months passed, carrying them closer without revealing why. Chanel felt it. Daniel felt it. Jason stood at the center, unaware. Truth hovered just beyond reach, present, patient, and waiting for the moment it could no longer remain hidden. And as the space between past and present narrowed, the tension did not break. It held. The invitation arrived without warning. Chanel stared at the screen longer than she needed to, the words settling slowly. A charity gala, formal, unavoidable, according to her supervisor. Attendance encouraged. Names listed beneath sponsors and executives. One name stood out. Daniel Wright. She exhaled, not sharply but steadily, the kind of breath taken when something long anticipated finally steps into view. For years she had managed distance with intention. Now, distance no longer felt possible. The evening of the gala arrived dressed in expectation. Chanel stood before her mirror longer than usual, adjusting details she rarely considered. Not for vanity, but for composure. She chose simplicity, nothing that demanded attention, nothing that suggested retreat either. When she arrived, the space was filled with soft conversation and measured movement. People spoke with ease practiced over time. Laughter surfaced, then softened. The room carried a sense of shared purpose, of generosity layered over influence. Chanel moved through it carefully, Then she saw him. Daniel stood across the room, speaking with a small group, his posture relaxed yet composed. He looked older, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that suggested weight carried and lessons learned. The sharp edges of youth had softened into something steadier. He turned. Their eyes met. The room didn't stop. The conversation around them continued. But something within that moment shifted quietly, decisively. Years folded inward. Daniel's expression changed first, surprise giving way to recognition, then something deeper. He excused himself without explanation and moved toward her. "Chanel," he said, her name settling gently between them. "Daniel," she replied. No questions followed immediately. No explanations rushed forward. They stood there, separated by inches and years, allowing the reality of each other's presence to settle. "You look well," Daniel said finally. "So do you," she answered. It was true. They spoke cautiously at first, neutral observations, polite exchanges. Each word measured, not out of fear, but out of respect for everything left unsaid. "I didn't expect to see you here," Daniel admitted. "Neither did I," Chanel replied. "But I suppose some things find their way back into our lives whether we plan for them or not." Daniel studied her, as if searching for familiarity in the changes time had made. "I've thought about you," he said quietly, "more than I realized." Chanel nodded. "I know." The honesty surprised him. They didn't stay long. The moment demanded space, not resolution. When they parted, it was without promises, but not without intention. Days later, Daniel found himself outside a small cafe he hadn't visited in years. He didn't question how he got there. Chanel was already inside. Their first conversation alone felt tentative but necessary. They spoke about work, about time, about how life rarely unfolds the way we expect. "I never stopped wondering what happened," Daniel said at last. Chanel held his gaze. Some things were harder to explain than to carry. He didn't press. Not yet. They met again. Coffee turned into walks. Walks turned into conversations that stretched beyond intention. They spoke honestly, but carefully, about growth, about mistakes, about the people they had become. Daniel listened the way he used to, fully, without interruption. Chanel noticed. "I missed this," she said once. "So did I," he replied. They avoided the past until it could no longer be avoided. One evening, as they walked through quiet streets, Daniel stopped. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Chanel didn't answer immediately. She looked ahead, then back at him. "I was afraid," she said simply. "Not of you. Of timing. Of adding weight to a life already carrying so much." Daniel absorbed the words slowly. "I wish you had told me," he said. "I know," she replied. "I do too." They didn't resolve everything that night. They didn't need to. Love didn't return as urgency. It returned as recognition. At home, Jason noticed the change. "You seem lighter," he said one evening. Chanel smiled. "Sometimes reconnection does that." Jason nodded, unaware of the depth behind her words. Daniel, meanwhile, found his thoughts shifting. Meetings felt less consuming, the office less isolating. He didn't tell Chanel about Jason. Not yet. She didn't tell him either. Some truths needed the right moment. As weeks passed, love reestablished itself carefully. Not as it once was, but as something tempered by time, shaped by understanding. They spoke late into the night. They laughed quietly. They allowed affection to exist without rushing its meaning. Love found its way back not as a demand, but as a choice, and neither of them realized how close the truth already was. The truth did not arrive with force. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Daniel sat alone in his office long after most of the building had emptied. The lights of the city pressed against the glass, distant and indifferent. He loosened his tie, not from discomfort but habit, and opened the remaining files his assistant had flagged for review. Most of them were familiar. Performance summaries, internal updates, a stack meant to be cleared before morning. One folder remained, intern evaluations. Daniel had reviewed dozens of them over the years. The process rarely held surprise. He scanned quickly, noting strengths, areas for growth, recommendations. When he reached Jason's file, he slowed without intending to. He read carefully. Commendations, consistency, leadership potential, reliability under pressure, nothing unexpected. Then his eyes drifted downward. Personal details, emergency contact, Background verification. A name, Chanel Wuckert. Daniel stopped reading. He leaned back slightly as though distance might clarify what proximity could not. His eyes returned to the page, slower now, tracing each letter with deliberate care. The name did not feel unfamiliar. It felt impossible. He checked the date of birth. 19 years. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's mind moved quickly, but his body did not. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the desk, as pieces he never knew existed began to align. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. His chest tightened, not with panic, but with recognition so deep it felt physical. He closed the file carefully, as though it might shatter if handled roughly. His son. The word formed slowly, deliberately, refusing to be dismissed. Daniel stood and moved toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass. He had built companies, negotiated outcomes that shaped thousands of lives, and yet nothing had ever prepared him for this. The truth hadn't been hidden. It had waited. Across the city, Chanel sat at her kitchen table, the same place where years earlier she had decided to remain silent. Jason was still at work, and the apartment felt unusually quiet. She felt it then, not fear but inevitability. Daniel called later that evening. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She answered. "Chanel," he said. "Yes." There was a pause, weighted and intentional. "We need to talk." "I know," she replied. They met at his apartment, a space that reflected order and restraint. Chanel stood near the window, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Daniel faced her, unsure where to begin. "How long?" he asked. 19 years, she answered. He nodded slowly. "You knew?" "Yes." He swallowed. "And Jason?" "He doesn't," she said. "Not yet." Silence settled between them, not hostile but heavy. "I didn't want to take him from you," Chanel continued. "I wanted to protect him. And you." Daniel looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not deception but exhaustion carried with intention. "You gave him everything," he said quietly. "Even when I didn't know I was missing it. I was afraid," she admitted, "of timing, of pressure, of breaking something that still mattered." Daniel nodded. "I wish I had known, but I can't pretend I don't understand." They sat together, the truth finally spoken, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked. "We tell him," Chanel said, "when we're ready." Together, Daniel agreed without hesitation. Jason deserved honesty. The moment came days later. Daniel asked Jason to meet him after work, not in the office, somewhere quieter. When Daniel spoke, he didn't rush. "I need to tell you something," he said. Jason listened. By the time the words landed fully, the room had gone still. "You're my father?" Jason asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Jason didn't speak for a long moment. Then he looked up. "You were my mentor," he said. "You taught me how to think." Daniel's voice broke. "And I want to learn how to be your father." Jason breathed out slowly. "I think," he said, "we can figure it out." The truth did not destroy anything. It opened something. The truth did not change everything all at once. It changed things slowly. In the days that followed, Jason moved through the world with a quiet awareness he had never known before. Nothing around him looked different, yet everything felt newly layered. Conversations carried more weight. Silences held new meaning. Daniel did not push. He understood now that presence mattered more than explanation. He stayed available without hovering, allowing Jason space to process a reality that rewrote the foundation of his life. Jason noticed. They began with small things, lunches that weren't meetings, walks that didn't require agendas, conversations that unfolded naturally instead of being guided toward outcomes. "You don't have to impress me," Daniel said once, gently. "You never did." Jason nodded. "I know." That knowledge settled slowly but firmly. At home, Chanel watched with a sense of calm she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The weight she had carried alone had finally shifted, not disappeared, but shared. She didn't interfere. She didn't guide. She trusted the process she had protected long enough to arrive here. One evening, the three of them sat together for the first time. No formality, no ceremony, just presence. Jason spoke first. "I don't feel like anything was taken from me," he said. I feel like something was added. Daniel exhaled, relief visible but restrained. I don't want to rewrite your past, he said. I just want to be part of what comes next. Jason smiled. That's enough. They didn't pretend everything would be easy. They didn't rush to define roles that would take time to grow naturally. They allowed the relationship to build the same way everything meaningful in their lives had always built, carefully, intentionally. Chanel felt something settle inside her that night. Peace. Not because the past was perfect. Weeks passed, routines adjusted, conversations deepened. Daniel learned how to listen in a different way, not as a leader or mentor, but as a father present without expectation. Jason learned that identity could expand without fracture, that knowing where he came from didn't change who he was. It strengthened him, and Chanel learned that silence, once necessary, no longer had a place here. On a quiet afternoon, Jason stood between them and said something simple. I'm glad you found each other again. Daniel looked at Chanel. She met his gaze. So am I, she said. The future did not promise certainty, but it offered something better. Choice. Some families are formed by time, some by intention, and some are rebuilt, not because they were broken, but because they waited for the right moment to begin again. Your presence here helps stories like this continue.